Welcome back to Pastor Emilie's Story Hour. We're reading The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. This is part 59. The story continued by Walter Hartwright. Sir Percival Glyde's name was mentioned among us no more. Thenceforward we shrank from the slightest approach to the subject of his death, and in the same scrupulous manner Marian and I avoided all further reference to that other subject, which, by her consent and mine, was not to be mentioned between us yet. It was not the less present in our minds, it was rather kept alive in them by the restraint which we had imposed on ourselves. We both watched Laura more anxiously than ever, sometimes waiting and hoping, sometimes waiting and fearing, till the time came. By degrees we returned to our accustomed way of life. I resumed the daily work which had been suspended during my absence in Hampshire. Our new lodgings cost us more than the smaller and less convenient rooms which we had left, and the claim thus implied on my increased exertions was strengthened by the doubtfulness of our future prospects. Emergencies might yet happen which would exhaust our little fund at the banker's, and the work of my hands might be ultimately all we had to look to for support. More permanent and more lucrative employment than had yet been offered to me was a necessity of our position, a necessity for which I now diligently set myself to provide. It must not be supposed that the interval of rest and seclusion of which I am now writing entirely suspended on my part all pursuit of the one absorbing purpose with which my thoughts and actions are associated in these pages. That purpose was for months and months yet never to relax its claims on me. The slow ripening of it still left me a measure of precaution to take, an obligation of gratitude to perform, and a doubtful question to solve. The measure of precaution related necessarily to the Count. It was of the last importance to ascertain, if possible, whether his plans committed him to remaining in England, or, in other words, to remaining within my reach. I contrived to set this doubt at rest by a very simple means. His address in St. John's Wood being known to me, I inquired in the neighborhood, and having found out the agent who had the disposal of the furnished house in which he lived, I asked if number 5 Forest Road was likely to be let within a reasonable time. The reply was in the negative. I was informed that the foreign gentleman then residing in the house had renewed his term of occupation for another 6 months, and would remain in possession until the end of June in the following year. We were then at the beginning of December only. I left the agent with my mind relieved from all present fear of the Count's escaping me. The obligation I had to perform took me once more into the presence of Mrs. Clements. I had promised to return, and to confide to her those particulars relating to the death and burial of Anne Catherick, which I had been obliged to withhold at our first interview. Changed as circumstances now were, there was no hindrance to my trusting the good woman with as much of the story of the conspiracy as it was necessary to tell. I had every reason that sympathy and friendly feeling could suggest to urge on me the speedy performance of my promise, and I did conscientiously and carefully perform it. There is no need to burden these pages with any statement of what passed at the interview. It will be more to the purpose to say that the interview itself necessarily brought to my mind the one doubtful question still remaining to be solved, the question of Anne Catherick's parentage on her father's side. A multitude of small considerations in connection with this subject, trifling enough in themselves but strikingly important when massed together, had latterly led my mind to a conclusion which I resolved to verify. I obtained Marian's permission to write to Major Donthorne of Varnock Hall, where Mrs. Catherick had lived in service for some years previous to her marriage, to ask him certain questions. I made the inquiries in Marian's name, and described them as relating to matters of personal history in her family, which might explain and excuse my application. When I wrote the letter, I had no certain knowledge that Major Donthorne was still alive. I dispatched it on the chance that he might be living, and able and willing to reply. After a lapse of 2 days, proof came in the shape of a letter that the Major was living, and that he was ready to help us. The idea in my mind when I wrote to him, and the nature of my inquiries, will be easily inferred from his reply. His letter answered my questions by communicating these important facts. In the first place, the late Sir Percival Glyde of Blackwater Park had never set foot in Varnick Hall. The deceased gentleman was a total stranger to Major Donthorne and to all his family. In the second place, the late Mr. Philip Fairley of Limmeridge House had been, in his younger days, the intimate friend and constant guest of Major Donthorne. Having refreshed his memory by looking back to old letters and other papers, the Major was in a position to say positively that Mr. Philip Fairley was staying at Varnick Hall in the month of August 1826, and that he remained there for the shooting during the month of September and part of October following. He then left, to the best of the Major's belief, for Scotland, and did not return to Varnick Hall till after a lapse of time, when he reappeared in the character of a newly married man. Taken by itself, this statement was perhaps of little positive value, but taken in connection with certain facts, every one of which either Marian or I knew to be true, it suggested one plain conclusion which was, to our minds, irresistible. Knowing now that Mr. Philip Fairley had been at Varnick Hall in the autumn of 1826, and that Mrs. Catherick had been living there in service at the same time, we knew also, first, that Anne had been born in June 1827. Second, that she had always presented an extraordinary personal resemblance to Laura. And thirdly, that Laura herself was strikingly like her father. Mr. Philip Fairley had been one of the notoriously handsome men of his time. In disposition entirely unlike his brother Frederick, he was the spoilt darling of society, especially of the women, an easy, light-hearted, impulsive, affectionate man, generous to a fault, constitutionally lax in his principles, and notoriously thoughtless of moral obligations where women were concerned. Such were the facts we knew. Such was the character of the man. Surely the plain inference that follows needs no pointing out. Read by the new light which had now broken upon me, even Mrs. Catherick's letter, in spite of herself, rendered its mite of assistance towards strengthening the conclusion at which I had arrived. She described Mrs. Fairley, in writing to me, as plain-looking, and as having entrapped the handsomest man in England into marrying her. Both assertions were gratuitously made, and both were false. Jealous dislike, which in such a woman as Mrs. Catherick would express itself in petty malice rather than not express itself at all, appeared to me to be the only assignable cause for the peculiar insolence of her reference to Mrs. Fairley, under circumstances which did not necessitate any reference at all. The mention here of Mrs. Fairley's name naturally suggests one other question. Did she ever suspect whose child the little girl brought to her at Limmeridge might be? Marian's testimony was positive on this point. Mrs. Fairley's letter to her husband, which had been read to me in former days, the letter describing Anne's resemblance to Laura and acknowledging her affectionate interest in the little stranger, had been written beyond all question, in perfect innocence of heart. It even seemed doubtful, on consideration, whether Mr. Fairley himself had been nearer than his wife to any suspicion of the truth. The disgracefully deceitful circumstances under which Mrs. Catherick had married, the purpose of concealment which the marriage was intended to answer, might well keep her silent for caution's sake, perhaps for her own pride's sake also, even assuming that she had the means in his absence of communicating with the father of her unborn child. As this surmise floated through my mind, there rose on my memory the remembrance of the Scripture denunciation which we have all thought of in our time with wonder and with awe. The sins of the fathers shall be visited on the children. But for the fatal resemblance between the two daughters of one father, the conspiracy of which Anne had been the innocent instrument and Laura the innocent victim, could never have been planned. With what unerring and terrible directness the long chain of circumstances led down from the thoughtless wrong committed by the father to the heartless injury inflicted on the child. These thoughts came to me, and others with them, which drew my mind away to the little Cumberland churchyard where Anne Catherick lay now buried. I thought of the bygone days when I had met her by Mrs. Fairley's grave, and met her for the last time. I thought of her poor helpless hands beating on the tombstone, and her weary, yearning words murmured to the dead remains of her protectress and her friend. "Oh, if I could die and be hidden and at rest with you!" Little more than a year had passed since she breathed that wish, and how inscrutably, how awfully it had been fulfilled. The words she had spoken to Laura by the shores of the lake, the very words, had now come true. "Oh, if only I could be buried with your mother! If only I could wake up at her side when the angel's trumpet sounds and the graves give up their dead at the resurrection!" Through what mortal crime and horror, through what darkest windings of the way down to death, the lost creature had wandered in God's leading to the last home that, living, she had hoped ever to reach. In that sacred rest I leave her. In that dread companionship, let her remain undisturbed. So the ghostly figure which has haunted these pages, as it haunted my life, goes down into the impenetrable gloom. Like a shadow she first came to me in the loneliness of the night. Like a shadow she passes away in the loneliness of the dead. Come back tomorrow for the next installment.